Chapter 2, Part 2 of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Bobbe. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Chapter 2, Part 2. The night of the Whitsuntide play had come, and Stephen from the window of the dressing-room looked out on the small grass-plot across which lines of Chinese lanterns were stretched. He watched the visitors come down the steps from the house and pass into the theatre. Stewards in evening dress, old Belvedereans, loitered in groups about the entrance to the theatre and ushered in the visitors with ceremony. Under the sudden glow of a lantern, he could recognize the smiling face of a priest. The Blessed Sacrament had been removed from the tabernacle, and the first benches had been driven, so as to leave the dais of the altar and the space before it free. Against the walls stood companies of barbells and Indian clubs. The dumbbells were piled in one corner, and in the midst of countless hillocks of gymnasium shoes and sweaters and singlets in untidy brown parcels, there stood the stout leather-jacketed vaulting horse waiting its turn to be carried up on the stage. A large bronze shield, tipped with silver, leaned against the panel of the altar, also waiting its turn to be carried up on the stage and set in the middle of the winning team at the end of the gymnastic display. Stephen, though in deference to his reputation for essay writing he had been elected secretary to the gymnasium, had had no part in the first section of the program, but in the play which formed the second section he had the chief part, that of a farcical pedagogue. He had been cast for it on account of his stature and grave manners, for he was now at the end of his second year at Belvedere, and in number 2. A score of the younger boys in white knickers and singlets came pattering down from the stage, through the vestry and into the chapel. The vestry and chapel were peopled with eager masters and boys. The plump, bald sergeant-major was testing with his foot the springboard of the vaulting horse. The lean young man in a long overcoat, who was to give a special display of intricate club-swinging, stood near watching with interest, his silver-coated clubs peeping out of his deep side-pockets. The hollow rattle of the wooden dumb-bells was heard as another team made ready to go up on the stage, and in another moment the excited prefect was hustling the boys through the vestry like a flock of geese, flapping the wings of his soutane nervously and crying to the laggards to make haste. A little troop of Neapolitan peasants were practicing their steps at the end of the chapel, some circling their arms above their heads, some swaying their baskets of paper violets and curtsying. In a dark corner of the chapel at the gospel side of the altar, a stout old lady knelt amid her copious black skirts. When she stood up, a pink-dressed figure, wearing a curly golden wig and an old-fashioned straw sunbonnet, with black penciled eyebrows and cheeks delicately rouged and powdered, was discovered. A low murmur of curiosity ran round the chapel at the discovery of this girlish figure. One of the prefects, smiling and nodding his head, approached the dark corner and, having bowed to the stout old lady, said pleasantly, "Is this a beautiful young lady or a doll that you have here, Mrs. Talon?" Then, bending down to peer at the smiling painted face under the leaf of the bonnet, he exclaimed, "No, upon my word, I believe it's little Bertie Talon, after all." Stephen at his post by the window heard the old lady and the priest laugh together, and heard the boys' murmur of admiration behind him as they passed forward to see the little boy who had to dance the sunbonnet dance by himself. A movement of impatience escaped him. He let the edge of the blind fall, and, stepping down from the bench on which he had been standing, walked out of the chapel. He passed out of the schoolhouse and halted under the shed that flanked the garden. From the theatre opposite came the muffled noise of the audience and sudden brazen clashes of the soldiers' band. The light spread upwards from the glass roof, making the theatre seem a festive ark anchored among the hulks of houses, her frail cables of lanterns looping her to her moorings. A side door of the theatre opened suddenly, and a shaft of light flew across the grass plots. A sudden burst of music issued from the ark, the prelude of a waltz. And when the side door closed again, the listener could hear the faint rhythm of the music, the sentiment of the opening bars. Their languor and supple movement evoked the incommunicable emotion which had been the cause of all his day's unrest and of his impatient movement of a moment before. His unrest issued from him like a wave of sound, and on the tide of flowing music the ark was journeying, trailing her cables of lanterns in her wake. Then a noise like a dwarf artillery broke the movement. It was the clapping that greeted the entry of the dumbbell team on the stage. At the far end of the shed near the street, a speck of pink light showed in the darkness, and as he walked towards it he became aware of a faint aromatic odor. 2 boys were standing in the shelter of a doorway, smoking, and before he reached them he had recognized Heron by his voice. "Here comes the noble Daedalus," cried a high, throaty voice. "Welcome to our trusty friend." This welcome ended in a soft peal of mirthless laughter as Heron salaamed and then began to poke the ground with his cane. "Here I am," said Stephen, halting and glancing from Heron to his friend. The latter was a stranger to him, but in the darkness, by the aid of the glowing cigarette tips, he could make out a pale, dandyish face, over which a smile was travelling slowly, a tall, overcoated figure, and a hard hat. Heron did not trouble himself about an introduction, but said instead, "I was just telling my friend Wallace what a lark it would be tonight if you took off the rector in the part of the schoolmaster. It would be a ripping good joke." Heron made a poor attempt to imitate for his friend Wallace the rector's pedantic bass, and then, laughing at his failure, asked Stephen to do it. "Go on, Daedalus," he urged. "You can take him off rippingly. 'He that will not hear the church, let him be to thee as the heathen and the publican.'" The imitation was prevented by a mild expression of anger from Wallace, in whose mouthpiece the cigarette had become too tightly wedged. "Damn this blankety-blank holder," he said, taking it from his mouth and smiling and frowning upon it tolerantly. "It's always getting stuck like that. Do you use a holder?" "I don't smoke," answered Stephen. "No," said Heron. "Daedalus is a model youth. He doesn't smoke, and he doesn't go to bazaars, and he doesn't flirt, and he doesn't damn anything or damn all." Stephen shook his head and smiled in his rival's flushed and mobile face, beaked like a bird's. He had often thought it strange that Vincent Heron had a bird's face as well as a bird's name. A shock of pale hair lay on the forehead like a ruffled crest. The forehead was narrow and bony, and a thin hooked nose stood out between the close-set prominent eyes, which were light and inexpressive. The rivals were school friends. They sat together in class, knelt together in the chapel, talked together after beads over their lunches. As the fellows in number 1 were undistinguished dullards, Stephen and Heron had been during the year the virtual heads of the school. It was they who went up to the rector together to ask for a free day, or to get a fellow off. "Oh, by the way," said Heron suddenly, "I saw your governor going in." The smile waned on Stephen's face. Any allusion made to his father by a fellow or by a master put his calm to rout in a moment. He waited in timorous silence to hear what Heron might say next. Heron, however, nudged him expressively with his elbow and said, "You're a sly dog, Daedalus." "Why so?" said Stephen. "You'd think butter wouldn't melt in your mouth," said Heron, "but I'm afraid you're a sly dog." "Might I ask you what you are talking about?" said Stephen urbanely. "Indeed you might," answered Heron. "We saw her, Wallace, didn't we? And deucedly pretty she is, too, and so inquisitive." "And what part does Stephen take, Mr. Daedalus? And will Stephen not sing, Mr. Daedalus?" "Your governor was staring at her through that eyeglass of his for all he was worth, so that I think the old man has found you out, too. I wouldn't care a bit, by Jove. She's ripping, isn't she, Wallace?" "Not half bad," answered Wallace quietly, as he placed his holder once more in the corner of his mouth. A shaft of momentary anger flew through Stephen's mind at these indelicate allusions in the hearing of a stranger. For him there was nothing amusing in a girl's interest and regard. All day he had thought of nothing but their leave-taking on the steps of the tram at Harold's Cross, the stream of moody emotions it had made to course through him, and the poem he had written about it. All day he had imagined a new meeting with her, for he knew that she was to come to the play. The old restless moodiness had again filled his breast as it had done on the night of the party, but had not found an outlet in verse. The growth and knowledge of 2 years of boyhood stood between then and now, forbidding such an outlet, and all day the stream of gloomy tenderness within him had started forth and returned upon itself in dark courses and eddies, wearying him in the end until the pleasantry of the prefect and the painted little boy had drawn from him a movement of impatience. "So you may as well admit," Heron went on, "that we've fairly found you out this time. You can't play the saint on me any more. That's one sure 5. A soft peal of mirthless laughter escaped from his lips, and, bending down as before, he struck Stephen lightly across the calf of the leg with his cane, as if in jesting reproof. Stephen's movement of anger had already passed. He was neither flattered nor confused, but simply wished the banter to end. He scarcely resented what had seemed to him at first a silly indelicateness, for he knew that the adventure in his mind stood in no danger from their words, and his face mirrored his rival's false smile. "Admit," repeated Heron, striking him again with his cane across the calf of the leg. The stroke was playful, but not so lightly given as the first one had been. Stephen felt the skin tingle and glow slightly and almost painlessly, and bowing submissively, as if to meet his companion's jesting mood, began to recite the Confiteor. The episode ended well, for both Heron and Wallace laughed indulgently at the irreverence. The confession came only from Stephen's lips, and, while they spoke the words, a sudden memory had carried him to another scene called up, as if by magic, at the moment when he had noted the faint, cruel dimples at the corners of Heron's smiling lips, and had felt the familiar stroke of the cane against his calf, and had heard the familiar word of admonition, "Admit." It was towards the close of his first term in the college, when he was in number 6. His sensitive nature was still smarting under the lashes of an undivined and squalid way of life. His soul was still disquieted and cast down by the dull phenomenon of Dublin. He had emerged from a 2 years' spell of reverie to find himself in the midst of a new scene, every event and figure of which affected him intimately, disheartened him or allured, and, whether alluring or disheartening, filled him always with unrest and bitter thoughts. All the leisure which his school life left him was passed in the company of subversive writers whose gibes and violence of speech set up a ferment in his brain before they passed out of it into his crude writings. The essay was for him the chief labor of his week, and every Tuesday, as he marched from home to the school, he read his fate in the incidents of the way, pitting himself against some figure ahead of him and quickening his pace to outstrip it before a certain goal was reached, or planting his steps scrupulously in the spaces of the patchwork of the footpath, and telling himself that he would be first and not first in the weekly essay. On a certain Tuesday the course of his triumphs was rudely broken. Mr. Tate, the English master, pointed his finger at him and said bluntly, "This fellow has heresy in his essay." A hush fell on the class. Mr. Tate did not break it, but dug with his hand between his crossed thighs, while his heavily starched linen creaked about his neck and wrists. Stephen did not look up. It was a raw spring morning, and his eyes were still smarting and weak. He was conscious of failure and of detection, of the squalor of his own mind and home, and felt against his neck the raw edge of his turned and jagged collar. A short, loud laugh from Mr. Tate set the class more at ease. "Perhaps you didn't know that," he said. "Where?" asked Stephen. Mr. Tate withdrew his delving hand and spread out the essay. "Here. It's about the Creator and the soul. Without a possibility of ever approaching nearer. That's heresy. Stephen murmured, I meant without a possibility of ever reaching. It was a submission, and Mr. Tate, appeased, folded up the essay and passed it across to him, saying, Oh, ever reaching. That's another story. But the class was not so soon appeased. Though nobody spoke to him of the affair after class, he could feel about him a vague, general, malignant joy. A few nights after this public chiding, he was walking with a letter along the Drumcondra road when he heard a voice cry, Halt! He turned and saw 3 boys of his own class coming towards him in the dusk. It was Heron who had called out, and, as he marched forward between his 2 attendants, he cleft the air before him with a thin cane, in time to their steps. Boland, his friend, marched beside him, a large grin on his face, while Nash came on a few steps behind, blowing from the pace and wagging his great red head. As soon as the boys had turned into Clonliffe Road together, they began to speak about books and writers, saying what books they were reading and how many books there were in their father's bookcases at home. Stephen listened to them in some wonderment, for Boland was the dunce and Nash the idler of the class. In fact, after some talk about their favourite writers, Nash declared for Captain Marryat, who, he said, was the greatest writer. Fudge, said Heron. Ask Daedalus. Who is the greatest writer, Daedalus? Stephen noted the mockery in the question and said, Of prose, do you mean? Yes. Newman, I think. Is it Cardinal Newman? Asked Boland. Yes, answered Stephen. The grin broadened on Nash's freckled face as he turned to Stephen and said, And do you like Cardinal Newman, Daedalus? Oh, many say that Newman has the best prose style, Heron said to the other 2 in explanation. Of course, he's not a poet. And who is the best poet, Heron? Asked Boland. Lord Tennyson, of course, answered Heron. Oh, yes, Lord Tennyson, said Nash. We have all his poetry at home in a book. At this Stephen forgot the silent vows he had been making and burst out, Tennyson a poet! Why, he's only a rhymester. Oh, get out, said Heron. Everyone knows that Tennyson is the greatest poet. And who do you think is the greatest poet? Asked Boland, nudging his neighbour. Byron, of course, answered Stephen. Heron gave the lead, and all 3 joined in a scornful laugh. What are you laughing at? asked Stephen. You, said Heron. Byron the greatest poet. He's only a poet for uneducated people. He must be a fine poet, said Boland. You may keep your mouth shut, said Stephen, turning on him boldly. All you know about poetry is what you wrote up on the slates in the yard and were going to be sent to the loft for. Boland, in fact, was said to have written on the slates in the yard a couplet about a classmate of his who often rode home from the college on a pony. As Tyson was riding into Jerusalem, he fell and hurt his Alec Cafusalem. This thrust put the 2 lieutenants to silence, but Heron went on. In any case, Byron was a heretic, and immoral too. I don't care what he was, cried Stephen hotly. You don't care whether he was a heretic or not? Said Nash. What do you know about it? Shouted Stephen. You never read a line of anything in your life except a trans, or Boland either. I know that Byron was a bad man, said Boland. Here, catch hold of this heretic, Heron called out. In a moment Stephen was a prisoner. Tate made you buck up the other day, Heron went on, about the heresy in your essay. I'll tell him tomorrow, said Boland. Will you? Said Stephen. You'd be afraid to open your lips. Afraid? Aye, afraid of your life. Behave yourself, cried Heron, cutting at Stephen's legs with his cane. It was the signal for their onset. Nash pinioned his arms behind, while Boland seized a long cabbage stump which was lying in the gutter. Struggling and kicking under the cuts of the cane and the blows of the knotty stump, Stephen was borne back against a barbed wire fence. Admit that Byron was no good. No. Admit. No.
Admit!"
"No, no!" At last, after a fury of plunges, he wrenched himself free. His tormentors set off towards Jones's Road, laughing and jeering at him, while he, torn and flushed and panting, stumbled after them, half blinded with tears, clenching his fists madly and sobbing. While he was still repeating the Confiteor amid the indulgent laughter of his hearers, and while the scenes of that malignant episode were still passing sharply and swiftly before his mind, he wondered why he bore no malice now to those who had tormented him. He had not forgotten a whit of their cowardice and cruelty, but the memory of it called forth no anger from him. All the descriptions of fierce love and hatred which he had met in books had seemed to him, therefore, unreal. Even that night, as he stumbled homewards along Jones's Road, he had felt that some power was divesting him of that sudden-woven anger as easily as a fruit is divested of its soft, ripe peel. He remained standing with his two companions at the end of the shed, listening idly to their talk or to the bursts of applause in the theatre. She was sitting there among the others, perhaps waiting for him to appear. He tried to recall her appearance, but could not. He could remember only that she had worn a shawl about her head like a cowl, and that her dark eyes had invited and unnerved him. He wondered, had he been in her thoughts as she had been in his? Then, in the dark and unseen by the other two, he rested the tips of the fingers of one hand upon the palm of the other hand, scarcely touching it, and yet pressing upon it lightly. But the pressure of her fingers had been lighter and steadier, and suddenly the memory of their touch traversed his brain and body like an invisible warm wave. A boy came towards them, running along under the shed. He was excited and breathless.
"Oh, Dedalus," he cried, "Doyle is in a great bake about you. You're to go in at once and get dressed for the play. Hurry up, you'd better."
"He's coming now," said Heron to the messenger with a haughty drawl, "when he wants to." The boy turned to Heron and repeated, "But Doyle is in an awful bake." "Will you tell Doyle with my best compliments that I damned his eyes?" answered Heron. "Well, I must go now," said Stephen, who cared little for such points of honour.
"I wouldn't," said Heron. "Damn me if I would. That's no way to send for one of the senior boys. In a bake, indeed. I think it's quite enough that you're taking part in his bally old play."
This spirit of quarrelsome comradeship, which he had observed lately in his rival, had not seduced Stephen from his habits of quiet obedience. He mistrusted the turbulence and doubted the sincerity of such comradeship, which seemed to him a sorry anticipation of manhood. The question of honour here raised was, like all such questions, trivial to him. While his mind had been pursuing its intangible phantoms and turning in irresolution from such pursuit, he had heard about him the constant voices of his father and of his masters, urging him to be a gentleman above all things, and urging him to be a good Catholic above all things. These voices had now come to be hollow-sounding in his ears. When the gymnasium had been opened, he had heard another voice urging him to be strong and manly and healthy, and when the movement towards national revival had begun to be felt in the college, yet another voice had bidden him to be true to his country and help to raise up her fallen language and tradition. In the profane world, as he foresaw, a worldly voice would bid him raise up his father's fallen state by his labours, and, meanwhile, the voice of his school comrades urged him to be a decent fellow, to shield others from blame, or to beg them off, and to do his best to get free days for the school. And it was the din of all these hollow-sounding voices that made him halt irresolutely in the pursuit of phantoms. He gave them ear only for a time, but he was happy only when he was far from them, beyond their call, alone or in the company of phantasmal comrades. In the vestry, a plump, fresh-faced Jesuit and an elderly man, in shabby blue clothes, were dabbling in a case of paints and chalks. The boys who had been painted walked about or stood still awkwardly, touching their faces in a gingerly fashion with their furtive fingertips. In the middle of the vestry, a young Jesuit, who was then on a visit to the college, stood rocking himself rhythmically from the tips of his toes to his heels and back again, his hands thrust well forward into his side pockets. His small head set off with glossy red curls, and his newly shaven face agreed well with the spotless decency of his soutane and with his spotless shoes. As he watched this swaying form, and tried to read for himself the legend of the priest's mocking smile, there came into Stephen's memory a saying which he had heard from his father before he had been sent to Clongowes, that you could always tell a Jesuit by the style of his clothes. At the same moment he thought he saw a likeness between his father's mind and that of this smiling, well-dressed priest, and he was aware of some desecration of the priest's office or of the vestry itself, whose silence was now routed by loud talk and joking, and its air pungent with the smells of the gas-jets and the grease. While his forehead was being wrinkled and his jaws painted black and blue by the elderly man, he listened distractedly to the voice of the plump young Jesuit, which bade him speak up and make his points clearly. He could hear the band playing "The Lily of Killarney," and knew that in a few moments the curtain would go up. He felt no stage fright, but the thought of the part he had to play humiliated him. A remembrance of some of his lines made a sudden flush rise to his painted cheeks. He saw her serious, alluring eyes watching him from among the audience, and their image at once swept away his scruples, leaving his will compact. Another nature seemed to have been lent him. The infection of the excitement and youth about him entered into and transformed his moody mistrustfulness. For one rare moment he seemed to be clothed in the real apparel of boyhood, and, as he stood in the wings among the other players, he shared the common mirth amid which the drop scene was hauled upwards by two able-bodied priests with violent jerks and all awry. A few moments after he found himself on the stage amid the garish gas and the dim scenery, acting before the innumerable faces of the void. It surprised him to see that the play which he had known at rehearsals for a disjointed, lifeless thing had suddenly assumed a life of its own. It seemed now to play itself, he and his fellow actors aiding it with their parts. When the curtain fell on the last scene, he heard the void filled with applause, and, through a rift in the side scene, saw the simple body before which he had acted magically deformed, the void of faces breaking at all points and falling asunder into busy groups. He left the stage quickly and rid himself of his mummery, and passed out through the chapel into the college garden. Now that the play was over, his nerves cried for some further adventure. He hurried onwards as if to overtake it. The doors of the theatre were all open, and the audience had emptied out. On the lines which he had fancied the moorings of an ark, a few lanterns swung in the night breeze, flickering cheerlessly. He mounted the steps from the garden in haste, eager that some prey should not elude him, and forced his way through the crowd in the hall and past the two Jesuits who stood watching the exodus and bowing and shaking hands with the visitors. He pushed onward nervously, feigning a still greater haste and faintly conscious of the smiles and stares and nudges which his powdered head left in its wake. When he came out on the steps, he saw his family waiting for him at the first lamp. In a glance he noted that every figure of the group was familiar, and ran down the steps angrily. "I have to leave a message down in George's Street," he said to his father quickly. "I'll be home after you." Without waiting for his father's questions, he ran across the road and began to walk at breakneck speed down the hill. He hardly knew where he was walking. Pride and hope and desire, like crushed herbs in his heart, sent up vapors of maddening incense before the eyes of his mind. He strode down the hill amid the tumult of sudden-risen vapors of wounded pride and fallen hope and baffled desire. They streamed upwards before his anguished eyes in dense and maddening fumes, and passed away above him till at last the air was clear and cold again. A film still veiled his eyes, but they burned no longer. A power, akin to that which had often made anger or resentment fall from him, brought his steps to rest. He stood still and gazed up at the sombre porch of the morgue, and from that to the dark cobbled laneway at its side. He saw the word "Lots" on the wall of the lane, and breathed slowly the rank, heavy air. "That is horse-piss and rotted straw," he thought. It is a good odor to breathe. It will calm my heart. My heart is quite calm now. I will go back. End of Chapter 2, Part 2.